Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this week's quick tip. Or maybe it's a long tip, I don't know yet, but I have the feeling it's going to be longer. This week we are going to talk about randomizing textures on repetitive objects. This might sound a little bit niche, but I assure you that I'm using this all the time because I have repeating objects in my scenes all the time, and I'm using this to offset the texture so they don't repeat per object. If you're confused now, don't worry, I will be explaining it right now. So let's jump into our scene here and go closer to what I have prepared here. So I've prepared a chip and a holder with repetitive parts, and those feet and those clamps here is what we're going to talk about today. So if I go outside of my camera, you can see those feet are a little bit dirtied up. And as usual in 3D, nothing is completely clean, so you normally would use some dirt or grime on everything you're doing in 3D. But since the object is repeating, and of course it has the same texture per object, the texture is also repeating. And this is a telltale sign that this is CG, because that does not happen in reality. So if you stick the chip inside of the clamps here, the scratches on every foot will be different, and therefore the repetitive nature of this texture is a very prominent sign that this is CG. In contrast to other videos I've done, I want to make this a little bit different in telling you how to set up the texture. Maybe you find something useful in there. If you're just here for the juicy bits, you can skip to the next chapter where I'm going to continue to explain what to do to randomize your textures. So let's get started. Before we do our materials, let's go over the scene structure real quick. So I have a null here labeled originals. If we unfold that, you can see there is a clamp and a leg in here. Now those originals are moved below so they don't appear in our camera view, but they are both linked to some objects here. So if we go to the holder IC, we can see that inside of the cloner here, there is this lag instanced here. And if I go to the original object, you can see it is linked to the clamp. And of course, the same is true for the legs of the chip. So if I go to the chip and then to the leg and choose the original here, you can see the leg here is linked. Now all of those links are set as render instance, and this is becoming an important thing later. What might be important to mention here is that since we have our instance already set to render instance, our cloner doesn't need to be a render instance. And since Octane doesn't allow render instances in render instances, say that 10 times quickly, that wouldn't render anyway. So it's important to set the instance as a render instance and then leave the cloner set to only be an instance. So now that we've looked at the scene structure, let's set up our metal material that is slightly dirtied up. Alright, so let's create our new material by going to Materials, Create, and then create a metallic material. So if you want to replace your old material by the new one, there's an easy trick. Just hold Alt and drag the new material on the old one and let go. And this then will override all the tags that the old material was assigned to with the new material. Just for completeness sake, I have mapped the tags on the material here on the pins and the clamps with a cubic mapping. Set the mapping to be fit object and then choose the biggest value here and move that to all the other ports. So 0.25, 125, 0.125. And I did that for the lag as well. So let's go into our nodes and create variants for our material by getting the active material here and create some variants. Now, how do we do the variants? Actually, the easiest way is by getting a texture. So I'll bring in an image texture And inside of the image texture, I will load our trusted old metal surface here that I'm always using for irregularities and imperfections. Alright, let me make some settings by going to the Octane material, go to Basic and set the BSDF model to GTX. Also call that metal. And then go to our texture and set the type to float to save some of our precious VRAM. Now we have this texture here that we can now pipe into our slots as, for example, specular and roughness. That will then create some variation in our shaders. So let's have a closer look here. Now, two things stand out. First of all, this is a raw input that we just piping into our textures here. And second, it is therefore very rough looking. And we want to have this effect a little bit more subtle. But just to explain this, and most of you probably know, this texture here is explicitly set up to have a value range from completely black to completely white values. And those values are then piped into the specular. That means where the texture here is black, we have no reflections, and where the texture here is white, we have full reflections. And the same goes for the roughness. You can think of that if we go to the texture roughness here and look at the float slider that usually controls the roughness of the texture. That float slider now is inactive and the texture controls the roughness between black, that means no roughness, and white, that means full roughness. And everything in between, of course, is then mapped everything in between of the roughness range. So to have a more subtle effect here, we will need something to remap this range. I'm sure most of you know that I usually use the gradient texture inside of Octane to remap my values. But today I'm going to do something different and introduce you to some new node. And this is the range node. So let's hit tab and call the range node, range, here we go. And actually this is doing almost the same as with the gradient node. So we have an input and then we can map from a minimum and maximum value to a other value. So to do that, let's do this for a roughness real quick. What I usually do is I will go and put the roughness slider to a value that I really like for this material. So let's say we are at 0.25 here and I'm happy with that. So let's get rid of the specular real quick so we don't get distracted. So our value 0.25 is the value we are happy with. So what we could do is take this range here and map it to 0.25. Now, when we plug that in, of course, nothing happens. So what we do to get our variance here is that we vary our min and max by a slight amount. So what we could do is instead of 2.5, let's go down with the minimum to 2 and up with the maximum to 3. So we are just having our value still around the value of 0.25, but with some variance. And you can see the variance showing up inside of the material. And we can do the same for our specular. So let's do this by duplicating that and piping in that to the value and then to specular. Now this has gone dark all of a sudden, and this is because the specular usually expects higher values. So for a proper metal, let's do a max value of 0.7 and a min value of 0.3, for example. And now you can see that we have some proper variance, and if you're not satisfied, you can of course change that to your liking. Usually I would make that even more subtle, but to let you see some changes that we are going to do with the variance in the next chapter, I'm leaving it as strong as it is, so otherwise you won't be able to easily see it. Now that we've done the material, let's do what we actually have come here to do. And this is to create different looks of textures for every of those objects. To do so, we need two components, a sort of a random or a different value for every one of those clones, and a way to move the texture by a value. So we can connect the value from every one of those clones to the offset and therefore get a different offset of the texture for every one of those objects. The good news here is that we already created the first thing, so we already have random values for each object. This is because we used render instances to do the job. So Octane has this very neat texture that is called random color, and if we apply that here, apply that to the specular and make it solo, you can see if you have render instances, Octane can utilize the random color to give your objects randomized color values. And if you're not satisfied with those, you can actually change the seed until you're happy. Alright, so let's tackle the second thing then, and this would be to offset your texture. So you might think that is being done with a transform, and this would be the logical step to do, but a lot of stuff usually goes through the projection node in Octane, and this is no different. So let's create a projection and see what's in there that we can use. Distort UV mesh sounds awfully lot like the thing we are searching for, so let's click that. And you can see there's some ports generated on the node. So let's see what those ports are. Those read rotation, scale, and translation. And this is exactly what we need for our job to be done. To explain to you what this node is doing a little bit better, I've prepared another scene. So let's jump into the scene real quick. In this very simple scene, I have loaded a UV texture and mapped it on a plane. And connected to the UV texture, there is our distorted mesh UV. Now inside of the distorted mesh UV, there's a little UI mishap going on. And this is the X and Y you can find on multiple values throughout here. So the X should be minimum value and the Y should be a maximum value. So you have to remap the X to min in your head and the Y to max. If you know that, probably the understanding is a lot easier. Next, we will need a texture to drive some of those values here. And what better than to use a gradient? So I'll hit tab and choose a gradient generator. You can see I've done this before. So let's actually pipe the generator into the diffuse and see what it's doing. So the generator is giving us a gradient from black to white along the U direction of the UV coordinates. So let's pipe our UV map back into the diffuse and then pipe the gradient inside of the scale. So nothing has happened here, and this is because our minimum and maximum range is set as a scale of 1. That means that black as well white is set to 1, so nothing changes here. But if I set the maximum value here to, for example, 0.5, you can see now our UVs are scaling along the gradient. So here at the beginning where the gradient is black, that corresponds to the 1 value, so our scale is still 1. And the other side where the gradient is white, that corresponds to the Y value or the max value, as you remember. That means that our scale now is half of that from the beginning, 0.5. So it's important to remember that the first value, the min value, always is connected to the black values in your input, and the max value is always connected to the white values in your input, and everything between those is interpolated. So if we are going to reverse that, setting the value of the start value, the min value, to 0.5 and the max value to 1, then our texture is starting small and then getting larger. You might wonder why the scale is happening in that sort of curved appearance, and this is because our gradient has a default gamma of 2.2. So if I set this to 1, our scale will be linear. Let me reset the scale real quick to talk about another thing. So since we are dealing with a 2D space, meaning U and V, we can actually use those vectors to offset or scale those independently. So let me show you how this is done by going into the offset here, translation, and setting the max value to 1, and then creating a RGB spectrum. So within the RGB spectrum, this is essentially a vector, a 3D vector with x, y, z coordinates. So since we are dealing with a 2D space here, only the x and y respective r and g are used inside of the vector here. Now, when we are connecting this, nothing is happening because the black value corresponds to the translation of 0. But if I now move the red channel, you can see this is corresponding to the u-axis of the coordinate system, and the green channel is corresponding to the v-axis of the coordinate system. So if we want to have a gradient in here that only corresponds to the v channel, let's just pipe it in like this. So it corresponds to both of those channels because it's black and white. And in the white color, all three R, G, and B channels are active. We can just multiply that with a full-on green channel. So let me find the multiply here. Multiply. And therefore only get a translation on the V coordinates. Now if your head is burning and you don't like this because it's getting too complex, don't worry. We are dealing with a way less complicated situation in our other scene. So what we are doing essentially is we are getting different color values for every object. So let me just bring in a float texture here and simulate this. So what we are having is we are having just different color values per object. That means our UVs are just offset per object, and therefore we are getting a different pattern of the texture on each object. And this is all we are doing in our other scene. Now for the completion's sake, this value here is not limited to Octane generated nodes. We can also pipe textures in here. So let me duplicate that and find our metalness tile texture here real quick. Here we go. And once we pipe that in, we can now see that the texture values are driving the translation. This might be a little bit much here, so we can actually get a lower value here to have this effect a little bit minimized. Okay, this is just, maybe some of you might like to play around with this, and this is another way to do that. Let's go back to our other scene now. Coming back to our project, let's clean up the node tree and pipe in the nodes into our respective channels so we get what we built for, and use the random color on our distorted UV mesh node. To let you see better what's going on, let's do a solo on the texture so we can see right now we're still getting a repetitive behavior here. So we want to pipe in the random color into the translation. From the experience, translation is mostly enough to get a good random behavior here. Right now nothing is happening, and this is because the max value is still 0. So as soon as I just move that max value from 0, you can see that some of those transforms or translations are moving faster than the others, meaning that they will produce different values from object to object. If you're still not satisfied with the way that is laid out, you can just increment the seed here and get a value that you are more satisfied with. Now, of course, you can do the same for the scale and the rotation. With scale, I sometimes refrain from doing that because that can have some problems with the texture density, meaning the resolution. But let's just do that for the demonstration's sake right now. So we scale from 1 to 2, for example, and now you can see that some of those objects have bigger scales than the others. The same goes for rotation. So if we pipe that into rotation, you can use a rotation from 0, for example, to 360 degrees to have a randomly rotated texture on your objects. Now, depending on your texture, this sometimes can look a little bit funny. For example, here where you have those diagonal lines here, if we go back to our shading and wait for it to catch up, you can see, especially with this texture here, this might be something you would not want. So you would leave the rotation alone. So you might think now this is the end of the tutorial, but far from it. Actually, this node here is pretty new. It came in with Octane 2021, I think, but don't hold me to it. It might have come in with an earlier version. But when I needed the offsets in my texturing workflow, they weren't there. So what I did was I wrote OSL scripts to do exactly the same thing. So since with OSL you are able to utilize a lot more functions, I was able to bring in even more features into that node. So we will go over that in the next chapter. To get the set OSL script, you can navigate to my site silverwing-vfx.de, which is hosting some of the OSL scripts. So if you go to free stuff and click on the OSL button here, that will take you to a Google Drive where I upload my newest OSL scripts. So the one you need is the OSL Random UV 1.6, and this is the latest one. Just for your info, there are zip files here too that contain a Cinema 4D scene as well, for some of the scripts to show you how they will be used. But right now, just download this one here and we will be on our way inside of Cinema 4D. Before we load our OSL script, let's talk about the shortcomings of our distorted mesh UV here. So to do so, let's go back into the solo node and see what we can see with that turned on. Let's zoom in even further. So first of all, sometimes I'd like to have rotation, but I want to restrict certain angles. So I want to be snapping to 90-degree angles, for example, so I can use the texture in an even more random way without getting those diagonal lines here, for example. To be fair, you might be able to do that with a modulo in here by getting the modulo in between the output and the input and doing some math magic. But it is rather complicated and it's more easy if you're having dedicated sliders to deal with that. The next point is the greatest downside to the Mesh Distort UV, and this is the mapping. So right now I'm using Cinema 4D's UVs to be mapping to the object. If you're using UVs, that might be fine, but right now Cinema 4D is set to cubic or box projection, and we are ending up with those horrible seams here everywhere. Now this project might be a bit forgiving since it's so small, but otherwise if you're having other objects, those seams can be really prominent and therefore you don't want them to be in your scene. What actually can be done about that would be to use a triplanar projection where the seams here are avoided by blending those two projections over each other. But since we are already using a projection and not a transform, we don't have room for another projection that would allow for triplanar to work. Last but not least, also a projection problem. If you're having a noise and want to project it in a 3D kind of way, you usually do that by going to the XYZ to UVW coordinates in a noise. You cannot do that if you want to transform your noise and at the same time want to leave it 3D, as it plays into the same flaw as with the triplanar projection, as you cannot use two projections on one material at the same time with the provided nodes right now. Now that we've talked about the advantages and disadvantages of the Distort Mesh UV, let's actually talk about how to make our life better with some OSL scripts. Octane and therefore Octane for Cinema 4D have two different ways of bringing in the OSL script. One is with a usual RGB texture. So if you go down to the respective portion of the nodes, you can bring an OSL script and then paste the code in here. But this is for texture-based OSL, and since we are dealing with a projection-based OSL, we need another way. You might be wondering why this projection node is still sitting around here, and this is actually the answer to our needs. As if we go in here and twirl down the menu here, there is the OSL projection portion here where I can paste in the code. So let's do this real quick by going and opening the code with any text editor you have, copying that out there and pasting inside of the code section here, and then hitting compile. And usually you're greeted with a compilation OK message. If I now extend the node a little bit, you can see that there are some inputs created for us, and actually they are pretty much the same that we are having in our old node here, with the difference being separating all the X's out and not relying on R, G and B channels to transport vectors, which is a little bit more easy to understand in my opinion. And I'm sure some of you already spotted the difference here, the biggest difference being that this also contains a texture projection. So we can have actually a projection in a projection. So let us go on and bring this tutorial to an end by setting up this projection node here inside of the material we created. So we don't need our old distorted UV mesh texture anymore, so we delete that and bring in the projection that we get through our OSL script instead. Please don't mind what's happening up here for now. We are just setting up the nodes before we are going to shade everything as intended. So let's create a connection to every one of those ports, as we are dealing with the same amount and the same way to use the random texture as we did before. So all the explanations I did before also go with this node, except the RGB texture is not necessary anymore because I splitted out the channels or the coordinates into different inputs. As intended, we want to use a triplanar projection here, so let me scroll up to the projection, bring in a projection and set it to triplanar. I have a tutorial about triplanar projection, so I'm not going over the details in here. What's important is that we also need a triplanar node after the texture here. So let's find that and bring that in, triplanar, and also connect the other port here, so we are fine. Now that we've done that, let's actually set up our material. So let's solo the triplanar node instead of the image texture here, and let's see what's coming out of that. And the projection looks very washed out. This is because our material is much too large. So let's actually use the transform to bring that down by going in the texture and click transform, and then use a value of 0.005 or something like that. That looks fine. The other thing we want to do is to increase the blend angle here to have a bit of a better blend between the projection here. For example, here you can see that there's still some line showing up. So if we go and set this to maybe 30, it's blended a little bit better. To also generate or create our randomness here, let's go inside of the texture projection OSL node and fiddle around with some values, mainly the offset 2 values here. So I didn't use the min-max naming scheme, but the from to naming scheme. So we are transforming from 0 to 1, for example. So let's just do that and transform the U and the V space to 1. And as easy as that, we have achieved some randomness again. But this time also, of course, with triplanar projection, which is a huge advantage. What you also might have seen is the stepping value here. And this value lets you increment your steps in between those both values. And this is best shown with the rotation. So let's scroll down to the rotation value here. And we have an angle from to an angle to. And if we dial in 0 to 360, we are ending up with the same problem we had to deal last time, and that is diagonal lines. But with the stepping, I could restrict the angles to 90-degree increments. So you end up having only 0 degree, 90 degree, 180 degree, 240 degree, and 360 degree. So let's do this real quick, and you can see that it works. Of course, you can also use other values as 45 degree. So now you have diagonal lines all over. So let's set it back to 90 degree again, and then actually go out of our solo and marvel at our randomly assigned textures to our instances here. And that actually concludes our tutorial for today. So if you are still there, thank you so much for sticking with me till the end. After last week's and this week's being huge tutorials, long tutorials, I might do a short one next week again. So I still haven't shown you the color offsetter that can produce color variation. So maybe I'll go over how to get random values if you're not using render instances in conjunction with the random color node. This brings me to the end of this tutorial, and I say thank you once more. I wish you a great time and happy randomizing. Bye!